Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Rebecca Goldberg. I am a co-facilitator of the Out of School Time Impact Group for Grantmakers for Education. We're so happy to have you here today, this Friday, to talk about an important topic around understanding the impact of grieving and loss on young people and thinking about ways to respond. We have a great lineup of experts here with us today that you'll learn a lot from. As we get started, we'd love to hear from you. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Share your name, pronouns, and organization. And just because of the nature of this pretty heavy topic, if you want to share one thing that made you smile this week, maybe keep that joy with us as well. It's always nice to hear what folks are smiling about. So today our goals are to dive into this topic around grieving and loss. If you were with us last month, you know that we were talking about the mental health crisis that young people are experiencing. We talked about supporting young people's mental health and well-being throughout these pandemics. We heard from the Upswing Fund for Adolescent Mental Health, as well as the Skillman Foundation, who shared about their grant-making strategies in that area. We heard from practitioners at Doc Wayne's Champions Network and Urban Neighborhood Initiatives in Detroit. And that recording is available on the EdFunders website. So if you weren't with us, I encourage you to go back and take a look. We focus on what strategies youth organizations can use to support young people with what they're experiencing, as well as how funders can respond. We have a similar conversation today, but diving into the impacts of grieving and loss specifically. In fact, this topic seems to be so relevant that there was another webinar yesterday from our friends at How Kids Learn Foundation and Temescal Associates with another set of scholarly academic experts who were terrific and really diving into this topic as well, thinking about grieving and loss and after school programs. I encourage you to seek that out on their website, and I'll include a briefing paper that they shared as a great resource. I'll put that in the chat in just a moment. But it definitely speaks to the relevance and how youth programs are really trying their best to respond to young people's needs right now. I want to give a big thank you to our colleagues at the New York Life Foundation. This is a big part of their investment portfolio, grieving and loss. It has been for quite a while. And they really took the reins here and organized this panel with their grantee partners. So I want to thank Marlyn Torres, who's going to facilitate today, and Maria Collins, who's going to be one of the panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to Marlyn. Here you can see our great panelists here, and we'll turn over to Marlyn to do some introductions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm Marlyn Torres, Senior Program Officer with the New York Life Foundation. And our two focus areas are to support out-of-school time programs that help middle school students grow and thrive, both socially and academically. That's the grant portfolio that I manage. And our other focus area is our childhood bereavement work, which my colleague Maria Collins, who is the Vice President of the Foundation, leads. Joining her on the panel, we have some of our bereavement partners who are experts in the field. As Rebecca mentioned, she's putting their full bios in the chat. So I'd like to briefly introduce each of our panelists since we have lots to cover during this webinar. We have Laura Landry, Director of Evaluation and Research at Judi's House and the JAG Institute. Judi's House has a two-pronged approach that provides one directs grief support services, and through their JAG Institute, they provide important research and evaluation on bereavement, including a very important data tool that we'll hear more about during the webinar that estimates the prevalence of childhood bereavement across the country. In addition, we have Sarah Wingerath Schlangler. Sorry, I probably said that incorrectly, my apologies, who is the Senior Program Director at Tuesday's Children. The organization was created after 9/11 and provides lifelong support to families affected by terrorism, military conflict, or other mass violence. Rounding out our panel of experts, we have Catherine Jaynes, who is the Senior Director of External Affairs of the COVID Collaborative. The collaborative is a diverse, sorry, I'm having buffering issues. My apologies. Give me 1 second. The collaborative includes a diverse team from various fields, including education, health, and industry. So as I mentioned, we have lots of important information and resources to share. So I'm going to dive right in. So Maria, my first question is to you. If you can provide a funder's perspective in terms of how long has the foundation supported this work, and why do we invest in childhood bereavement? Why is this important as a funder? And if the second part is, if you could also highlight 2 projects that we're supporting to share with the group.
Of course. Thank you, Marlyn. And I'm happy to be here today with my fellow partners to discuss this really common yet overlooked issue. And I won't give the numbers. We have experts here, but I will say the first time I actually dove in and found out the prevalence, I was amazed. And so just to give you some history on New York Life actually started to fund this area or really look at this area in 2007. And we did so because someone approached us and saying, as a life insurance company, and based on your pronged approach of, humanity, integrity, financial strength, you should be funding childhood bereavement. Light bulb went off. So it only took less than 6 months to really, in 2008, to say this should be a focus area for the company as well as the foundation. And since that time, we've invested, and dollars are important, but really, I think I'll go into, we've invested over $60 million in this focus area. That is still nascent, right? A lot of people don't know about it. The awareness is not there. And really the support, because that's why we're here, to really elevate, one, the awareness and the prevalence of this issue, especially now that as we are all hopefully coming out of COVID, the impact that COVID has had on young people is tremendous. And I think that really highlights the impact of death on just individuals. And Laura will go over the numbers. Second, we said, well, are there resources? Again, Laura's going to show you the prevalence and then the gaps in services. What do we need to do? Third is in addition to, because not everyone's in a fund bereavement, it aligns with us as a life insurance company. It aligns with our humanity. But there are other resources, as we say, the supporting cast that needs to be engaged. And Catherine and Sarah will talk about how other programs can really support these young people that have experienced one of the most traumatic things in their life, losing a parental figure at such a young age without having that guidance to continue on. So I think that's why we fund it. I mean, basically, it's part of our DNA. And I'm speaking to funders right now. You don't necessarily have to fund bereavement resources, but understanding how the loss of a parent or significant loved one in a child's life can affect them, the impact that it has, not having support, not having acknowledgement, can all lead to really adverse reactions. You can support them in other ways, either through financial, which Catherine's going to go over, after school programming, so that continued support, having additional role models. Sarah's going to talk about mentoring. So we're coming at this from different angles. We are supporting direct service, research, awareness for specifically bereavement, death of a loved one. However, we need partners to come in. What are the other support and, resilient building opportunities for these young people? And that's why we're here today, to talk about that really systems holistic approach and what we're doing to really solve this issue. So I didn't give any statistics away because I'm going to let the experts dive deep into it. But I'm also a social worker, and I spent less than a day talking about grief and loss, and it should have had more attention. And that's why we are here. So Marlyn, just to put it plainly, it really fits into our DNA. It's authentic to who we are, but we need other people to have that other support in other realms, in other domains.
Yes, thank you, Maria. And I'd like to highlight, again, there's some resources that are going to be put in the chat. One of the resources is our Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative, which is for educators and youth development professionals, some basic information on how to support grieving students. And there's also information on the foundation's coalition to support grieving children. So I encourage all of you to check out those resources after today's webinar. So now transitioning to Laura and our bereavement expert panel. As part of your efforts, your team developed and manages the childhood bereavement estimation model. This tool illustrates the prevalence of childhood bereavement in communities across our country. Can you talk a little bit more about what trends you're seeing across the country? What's the importance of data, and why does it matter? Laura?
Absolutely. Thank you, Marlyn. And thank you all for the opportunity to participate in this important conversation today. So I might share my screen and start talking about through my slides. So let me do that real quick. Okay. So let me click through. So yes, as Marlyn said, the team at Judi's house, funded through the New York Life Foundation in partnership with the New York Life Foundation, developed the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, or the CBEM, to quantify the magnitude of childhood bereavement in our country. So the CBEM is a public health tool. It's a statistical model, and we utilize publicly available data. We take the most recent 5 years of publicly available data available through the Census Bureau and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to develop estimates that help us understand and raise awareness about childhood bereavement. So before I jump in and share the data, and then I can I'll highlight some trends as Marlyn identified. I wanted to talk a little bit about where the data come from and show what the model produces. I'm only going to highlight on this slide what I'm going to actually talk about because there's a lot of information on this slide. So today I'm going to show you data on projected CBEM estimates, which approximate the number and percentage of youth who will experience childhood bereavement. In terms of the source of bereavement, I'm going to highlight bereavement due to the death of a parent or sibling, and then show you at the county level, bereavement due to the death of a parent. And today I'm going to focus on national results with a quick look at some state results and some county results. And then in terms of ages, our data are available for youth up to age 18 and also youth and young adults up to age 25. So I will share some data relevant to both of those age groups. And finally, in this last column, I've just highlighted some of the special analyses and the key topics that our team has focused on over the years relevant to childhood bereavement. Today, I'm going to share national race and ethnicity results that we just released in November of 2021. So let's look at some of the data and talk about some of the trends. On this slide, you see the 2021 National CBEM projected prevalence data showing that 1 in 14 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. That's 7.3% of all US children, or 5.3 million children, which more than doubles to 13.3 million youth and young adults who will experience bereavement by age 25. Our 2022 updated numbers show an increase in bereavement, and that increase shows 1 in 13 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18, which is 7.7% of all youth, or 5.6 million youth. So as I mentioned, we use the most recent 5 years of data available. Our 2022 CBEM includes data from 2016 to 2020. So in the new numbers, we're able to look at first impacts of the pandemic. So our team was not surprised to see an increase in bereavement among youth, given that the new data includes a year of bereavement or a year of the pandemic. But what I want to highlight too is the slide you're seeing right now does not include data from during the pandemic. These data are from 2015 to 2019. And so at that time, before the pandemic, the CBIM estimated what you see here, that 5.3 million youth will experience bereavement by their 18th birthday. And so although there are significant impacts from COVID and overall from the pandemic, this has been a significant issue before that. On this slide, we see the 2021 CBIM state results visualized, and you'll notice that childhood bereavement rates vary quite a bit across the country, with a range of 5.6% of youth in the state of California to 11.5% of youth in West Virginia. We have not yet released our 2022 findings yet at the state level, but as I just mentioned with the national data, there was a jump in bereavement across all states, with the largest increase in New Mexico and in West Virginia. And those increases are directly related to parent death loss. We did not see any increases in bereavement due to the death of a sibling. So in this slide, I want to point out that while California has the lowest bereavement rate in the country, given the large population, 5.6% of youth being bereaved in California equates to more than 500,000 children, which is the most in any state. And so that I think the slide definitely highlights that bereavement is a significant issue across the country. So our team wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and we wanted to look at childhood bereavement prevalence by race and ethnicity. So as I mentioned, we conducted these analyses and we just disseminated these data in November. We utilize, again, data available through the Census Bureau, which gathers data on race and ethnicity separately. And so we conducted separate analyses on race and ethnicity. What I've highlighted on this slide for you is the data that's available from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on mortality data. Data are available for these 4 race categories, and then also for these 2 Hispanic origin categories. I'll be referring to this as ethnicity. So we know that racial and ethnic identity is more complex than what's outlined here, but the data that are available are limited to these categories from the Census Bureau. And so our team capitalized on the data that were available to conduct these analyses. Before I show you the actual CBIM results, I wanted to provide population data to help contextualize those results. So the demographic makeup of the population varies greatly, obviously, by where you're located. And so it's important to take that into account when you're thinking about the size of the population for each of these groups. Here you'll see the breakdown of the population of youth under age 25 in our country. And we see that the US is a primarily white population. So when we look at the actual numbers, we'll see that there are more bereaved white children in our country than children of any other race. And that is simply because there are more white children in our country. But when we look at rates, we see significant differences in prevalence rates based on race and ethnicity. So I'm going to show you those numbers right now. They are astounding. On this slide, we see projected prevalence results for parent or sibling bereavement. We visualize the percent and ratio of children and youth who will be bereaved by age 18 in the chart on the left and by age 25 in the chart on the right. I've included a line on these charts that displays the national rate. So this is the rate I just was sharing with you, that nationally 7.3% of all youth by age 18 will be bereaved. These charts demonstrate that when we conduct analyses by race and ethnicity, we see incredibly different childhood bereavement rates across categories. So we'll take a look at this age 18 slide. By age 18 slide, as I said, the national rate is 7.3%. If we look over here in the light green, we see that 8% of Indigenous youth will be bereaved by age 18, which is slightly higher than the national rate. In the middle, another highlight, if we look at the dark green, we see that 10% of Black or African American children will be bereaved by age 18, which is nearly 1.5 times the national rate and higher than any other race categories. When we move over to the chart on the right, showing bereavement by age 25 for youth and young adults, we see a similar pattern, that rates increase across the board for all groups. And we still see these differences that we're seeing in the by age 18 chart. Those remain. So the pattern remains the same, but all of the rates go up. So certainly these data highlight the need for grief and trauma-informed supports for youth. Before we move into conversations about how to support grieving children, I wanted to provide one more map This is the one Maria mentioned that serves as a visual gaps analysis. So this map displays county level sebum prevalence data for children who will be bereaved by age 18 due to the death of a parent. Specifically, when we conducted these analyses at the county level, we had to only focus on parents because the sibling data is suppressed at this level, at this geographic unit. So we see, again, incredible variation across the country in rates, going from 2% of youth in the lightest green to 25% of youth who will be bereaved by age 18 in the darkest green. The blue dots on this map represent sites serving grieving children gathered from our partners listed on the bottom of this slide who help to track resources available for grieving children. And you can see that there are huge gaps in various places across the country where there are no sites serving grieving children, huge gaps for communities across the country. So I'm so grateful that this group is having a conversation today about this important issue. For those of you who are interested in further exploring childhood bereavement prevalence, we have lots of resources on our website. And so you can click on any of these links. We'll send these out. These are all clickable and you can go and see some of those references. So now that we have a little better understanding of the magnitude, we can focus on how to address the need and have some conversations about resources that are available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Indeed, very important data on how many children are grieving the loss of a parent or a sibling. So we clearly see, based on the slides you share with us, just what a prevalent issue this is for our country. And I think, as you all would agree, that this has multiple and long-term ripple effects on children and families, right? Death, it's a permanent. Thanks again, Laura. And now switching to Sarah. Sarah, your organization, Children's Tuesday's Children, my apologies, I keep flipping it in my head. Tuesday's Children, I did it again, was established after 9/11, 20 years ago. And since then, your mission has continued to grow and evolve, serving military families and other families impacted. So how do we address the impacts of bereavement, specifically for children? How can youth organizations be assisted, be trained, or to identify children who are grieving, and what kinds of supports do the children need, and can a youth serving organization provide? So in other words, organizations that aren't the traditional bereavement support organization, but obviously have children that are grieving and suffering the loss of a parent or loved one. How can these organizations help these children and families?
Thank you for having me today, Marilyn. That's a fantastic way to kick off our discussion today around Tuesday's Children. I do want to make a note, and maybe this is obvious to a lot of people, but September 11th was a Tuesday, and that's the origin for the name Tuesday's Children. We have stayed very steadfast to the families of September 11th, and we've continued to evolve our mission to include, as you mentioned, families of the military fallen, 9/11 responders, and others impacted by mass violence. I am going to take a second to share my screen, but in short, just to kind of put a finer point on your question is, we really see the need in terms of providing resiliency support and programs meant to empower and build strength within our community. We're very much centered around the concept of long-term. There's a lot of resources providing the acute needs, and we see ourselves as being those that will walk with these families for the trajectory of their post-loss experience. So if you'll just humor me for 1 second. There we go. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. And thank you again. Oh, appreciate that thumbs up, Susan. So it's really truly an honor and a privilege to be here. And I want to highlight the different handouts that Rebecca is kindly going to be dropping into the chat. And I hope that those are of a tremendous resource for you. This talk today is really very much around, again, the long-term healing aspects that can come with the work that Tuesday's Children does, and hopefully the collaboration that comes from our discussion today. We often describe our work as long-term healing, applying the lessons from September 11, 2001 and other tragedies to inform our best practices and make sure that we're doing community-based recovery and resilience work. Our initial service population was the 3,051 youth that lost a parent that day on September 11th. And we've expanded to include other populations, as I've already mentioned. The devastating emotional impact that September 11th had was the creation of our organization. It serves as kind of the ethos that we remain centered around. And we really embody the concept of not about me without me as we use our family advisory boards, as we survey, as we use data. Thank you again, Laura, for your data that helps us empower us in this work. Over 2 decades of work have meant that we have served 45,000 individuals through what we call our long-term healing model. It's a proven approach to building resilience and post-traumatic growth and common bonds. We've expanded our services to respond to the ripple effects and making sure that we have hypervigilance around the gaps that are being left in so many communities. We consider ourselves a trusted resource for families and children and communities on their long road to recovery. We have a little bit of a misnomer in the fact that our name says children. We do serve the entire family unit. So here's a little bit of data in terms of the ripple effects that Tuesday's Children has seen. And every tragedy has a unique scope, as we all know. But knowing that there are often underserved groups, that is very important to have a conversation around that emerge. And knowing that there's a lot to be done with this work. Sadly, now we're living in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've lost more than 6 million lives. It's estimated that 200,000 children in the US have lost a parent or primary caregiver, and many have lost that sole caregiver. So for us in New York City alone, which is where our origin of our organization is, the vast majority of children who lost a parent who are not white, and they're facing many disparities in access to care, which is furthering the inequities that we're seeing. The pattern is emerging in other parts of the country as well. For us, in terms of the emotional impact of traumatic loss, this is really the question that I'm hoping to cover with each of you today. The question of how do we address the impact of bereavement. What we know is that traumatic loss has a profound emotional and physical impact, and it's a defining characteristic in their grief. The emotional and physical wounds can take longer and can be more complicated to heal. While there's no defined timeline for healing, we can recognize the common bonds in these situations that we've seen in other populations too, such as social isolation, fear of being forgotten, and disrupted family dynamics. So our approach, knowing that we only have a few minutes together, really is about, again, highlighting the need for long-term healing. We've taken what we've learned over 20 years of service and really codified that to give us some of our key lessons learned. It's really important that we remember that trust is the foundation of our work, and building a community and a circle of care and support is so important. We know from our work that the natural community supports, as in systems that are already interfacing with children and families, can make the most difference. We need to build the capacity of structures like pediatricians, school systems, places of employment, or faith-based supports to better understand the bereavement needs of families. The adaptive nature of our long-term healing model is what has informed our program development. Much of our programming, as you can see, is not clinical in nature, but it's community-based supports to connect families and each other for peer-to-peer dialogue and meet their evolving needs. You can see a lot of our cornerstone programmings are working with both the youth and family organizations and supports as they move through their own grief. We often say that they are doing their best to not only survive, but thrive. And that's the idea of the strength-based model that is Tuesday's Children. We will continue to provide guidance and consultation to other communities, and we want to help navigate as we are in this world of so much bereavement around us. And we hope that we can do that in a long-term way. A specific example is our mentoring program here at Tuesday's Children. We provide an opportunity for an agent of change to go directly into the life of a bereaved child. One of the things Maria mentioned earlier is the loss of a parental figure and the impact that that can have. And of course, knowing that there are adverse reactions that come with that tragedy. But what makes us unique is we're able to provide a dedicated adult role model that understands the long-term needs. They've been trained and they've been screened, and we've implemented this long-term youth healing model because it's based on a friendship model, and you can see it in a community-based setting. You can see it in an e-mentoring setting. It's taken many, many forms. We also have a career resource center, which includes professional mentoring. And it's a way for us to have a trauma-informed care approach to providing a mentoring experience with long-term connection. Tuesday's Children was recently funded by the New York Life Foundation for a 3-year project to build capacity of key sectors interfacing with children and families to address COVID bereavement. I just want to encourage anyone to reach out in terms of any collaboration to help tackle this growing challenge. And of course, the link at the bottom is clickable and we'll provide these resources. I want to highlight that we have an offering coming up. It's our annual forum and speaker series around lessons in recovery and resilience. We've just opened up registration, and it's free to register. I would encourage you all to take a minute and join us for this incredible dialogue that is so important. I want to encourage you to visit our website to learn more. You can follow us on our social media channels, of course, and feel free to reach out to me directly. I also want to highlight the secondary website that Tuesday's Children has. It's called tuesdayschildrenheals.org. What you'll find there is a codification of 20 years of lessons learned, and really helps you as you are navigating how you can impact change in our bereaved community. I want to thank each of you for having us here today. It's an honor and a privilege, truly, and I want to thank the COVID Collaborative as well, who has been walking with us on this journey as we really work not only with the federal government and others, especially at the White House, to impact positive change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing those resources and the work that you and your team are doing at Tuesday's Children for so many children and families over the long term. So, transitioning from, 9/11 was a very stark and clear inflection point for our country. And now shifting to another, which is COVID and the impacts of COVID on hundreds of thousands of children and families in the US and millions globally. So segueing to the COVID Collaborative and Catherine. So the COVID Collaborative, just to highlight a few points, have released their report, Hidden Pain, which takes a closer look at the scale, the impact, and most importantly, the solutions to address this issue and the supports that we all can provide children who are coping with the death of a parent or caretaker. And there are two, Catherine, not to take away from your presentation, but I think it's so poignant to point these two statistics out at the beginning before I turn it over to you, is that, and Sarah, you mentioned this, that close to 200,000 children have lost a parent or a caregiver due to COVID. And I'm sure since the report was released at the end of last year, this number has certainly increased. So that right there, if we just kind of pause and think about that, let's take a minute and sort of absorb that number. The second statistic is the relates to the racial inequities.
That's right.
And that due to these racial inequities, we see that as the report states, and I'm quoting from the report now, COVID's hidden loss falls heaviest on minority children. Non-white children lost caregiving adults up to nearly 4 times the rate of their white peers. So that was another statistics when I was reading the report that really struck me. You kind of hear about the racial inequities, but a statistic like that, 4 times the rate. And in the report, more importantly, as I mentioned, it also provides a blueprint for, okay, how do we help these children, right? What can we do? So with that, Catherine, I'd like to ask you if you could talk a bit more about the report, the findings of the report, and the COVID collaborative resources, and what specifically can we do to help these children?
No, thank you. And thank you for having me today. The report was, as Marilyn said, was released in December, but a little bit of background on why the report was created and the tone of the report. The COVID Collaborative founders, John Bridgeland and Gary Edson, actually were the designers of the President Bush's PEPFAR, his emergency response to the AIDS epidemic. And as they were developing that response, what they recognized was the number of children that were being left behind by that epidemic. And so as they developed this COVID collaborative, which was in response to the pandemic, it is bipartisan. It is about getting vaccines and information to the country that is fact-based and is thoughtful and is actionable. They really knew immediately that there was going to be a significant impact on children based on the loss of a caregiver and or a parent. And Dan Teglia has done a great job with the report, and on our website, hiddenpain.us, we have the updated numbers, and our numbers are very close with Laura's. We're up to about 203,000 children have lost a caregiver. 91,000 of those have lost a parent, and we are over 15,000 have been orphaned in the last 2 years. So I know Laura's estimates are based on a lifetime of up to 18. We are talking about in the last 2 years alone. Unfortunately, most of these children that are experiencing this loss are under the age of 13. And to Marilyn's point, we know that non-whites are being disproportionately impacted by this loss. And to go even further, we know that within 6 states, it's Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, New York, and Texas, those 6 states count for half of all caregiver loss. And so we continue to get updates on the numbers, and as Laura's numbers will read next year, it's going to continue to get worse before it gets better. And one of the things that we wanted to do with the Hidden Pain report was to not just give the data, but we also wanted to spotlight there is good research that talks about grief. And so we know that most children will go through grief in what we call a normal grief. There will be some children that will be identified that have longer grief and more in-depth grief that will need to know, or that will need to have additional supports. And because of that, we also wanted in the report to identify the work of many of the partners that are on the call today, but to know that there is support available. And what the issue we're finding today is connecting, first identifying, which I can talk about, but identifying and then connecting not only the children and families to the resources that they need, but also connecting the community and the nonprofits that are working in the space back to the family and caregivers. And so what we did, and with the support of New York Life, we couldn't have done it without them, but we released the report and then we said, so what's next? How can we not only continue the drumbeat, but how can we build a coalition of individuals that are both on the science side, the advocacy side, and the nonprofit side to help these children? And so As many of you all know, and many of the individuals on this call, we sent a letter to President Biden in January asking for an executive order. And we worked very closely with the White House. There was one line in the State of the Union that referenced the grief and the grief that these children are going through. We were very thrilled with that sentence, but we're even more optimistic that we believe that an executive order may be forthcoming. If not an executive order, but there will be federal action that is asking not only the agencies themselves to look within their own programs, not asking for additional funding per se, but look within their own programs in their departments to say, what are the programs that have flexibility in language that we can direct resources to these children. We've also known that Representative Watson-Coleman has done a resolution on the week of March 7th, asking her colleagues to really understand this issue. And then we're working with members in the Senate to hopefully not only potentially do a Dear Colleague letter, but also potential resolution and some legislation to bring awareness to this issue of grief and mental health, and really using COVID as kind of the wedge issue to get broader action. With respect to the resources, the hiddenpain.us website was launched with a Today Show segment on March 7th. We were thrilled that the Today Show picked up and was interested in the well, not only in the issue, but really in the website as well. And the website was designed to do three things. One, to continue to update with the data. Two was to share the work of the partners and to allow individuals to come and say, I am experiencing loss. What do I need to know? So there's federal resources. We know about the reimbursement for funerals, but there's also rent relief, and there's relief for student loans, and there's relief for, in some markets, for internet access. So for those individuals and families that are experiencing this loss, let's get them directly to some of the resources that we know are on the federal level. We also wanted them to provide our partners resources another way to access our partners resources. And so many of our partners that are here on the call and elsewhere that will help parents and caregivers understand if their children are experiencing normal grief, if they potentially may need additional resources. But we also wanted to make sure that schools and communities had the connection to resources. We know, as Maria can talk to, there are several schools in several areas that have 100+ children that have experienced loss. And so there are some of these epicenters that we really need to pay attention to. And finally, we are setting up a youth council so that we can hear from the individuals themselves. And I know Tuesday's Children and Mentor and some of our partners are really going to help build a community for these youth that will bring support to them, but will also give a voice and help direct us as I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat. As we go through, we know that this is not going to end. We might think that pandemic is ending, but the grief will not end for many of these children. And so our work begins now that we know what the issues are, we have the partners identified, and now it's on us to actually push the support to the community, build that network, and most importantly, find ways to identify the children. If there's one thing that we don't know is we don't have the ability, whether it's through Social Security, IRS, or any of the local organizations, to systematically identify children who have lost a parent or caregiver. And so that is something that we are working on with others. But if there's anyone in this community that is interested in supporting that work, that would be the ask as we go forward. So I'll stop there. Marilyn, I hope that answered your question. I feel very long-winded, especially without a slide, but.
No, that was very informative. Thank you, Catherine. Very helpful information. So I'll ask all the speakers to answer this question, and I'll go back up to the top, and I'll start with Laura, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. So type in your questions, please, so we have some time to answer a few questions. Catherine, you mentioned the youth council, right? And we have to keep the youth in mind and definitely hear their voice. So what's your advice, and this is to each of the panelists, for organizations that are working with young people that are experiencing grief and loss? So both for the funder community and the provider community, what would be your one advice or call to action? And Laura, if you could start us off.
Sure. I mean, I think what we know from the data that we've reviewed and talked about today is that if an organization is serving youth, they are serving grieving youth, given where the numbers are at. And so I think having this conversation and bringing awareness, knowing the numbers, I think is helpful. We talked about that a little. And I think, Marilyn, I appreciate you giving a pause to, hey, we're talking about 200,000. We're talking with the CBIM, absolutely, Catherine, that it's a longer timeline, right? By age 18, we're talking about 5.2 million. So I think I would encourage folks to use the data that are available to just think a little bit about what that means for their community. There are opportunities for us to develop community-specific reports if people are interested in that, but even just looking at the state data or the county data to see what's going on in their community and have a level of awareness. And then I'm excited about what we talked about today in terms of the resources already highlighted available through Tuesday's Children, what Catherine just talked about in terms of the Hidden Pain website and what they've put together, and New York Life's additional partners to building grief-sensitive communities. There are a lot of resources available where there can be an easy plug-in. And so in terms of, I don't know if there's a grantee meeting, for example, and you could share some of that data and highlight some resources so that all of the grantees at one time have an opportunity to learn, I think that would be amazing. And otherwise, I think it's just educating ourselves. There's a lot of information out there to help you even know how to have a conversation and approach a grieving child and have a conversation to open up discussion and allow them to feel safe. So that was more than just one thing, Marlyn, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach indeed. So Sarah, can you build on that in terms of, for both the funder and the youth provider community, what would be your advice or call to action in terms of identifying, this children that may be grieving the loss of a parent or a significant loved one, and what we can do?
Absolutely. Sure, Marilyn. I think that those of us on this call know, but we could all use a reminder that one thing we've learned is the attention on grieving children wanes over time. People move on, as some might say. And it's really important to remember that children re-grieve and have additional grief responses and experiences that require program and services to meet long-term needs. Mentoring specifically is a program that could always use more resources. And there are very few trauma-informed mentoring programs or those that have grief-specific mentoring models in our shared space of service. So keeping in mind that, as Laura said, we're all serving grieving children, but to have the right tools, the right resources, the right language, just even as simple as the right marketing materials will allow us to really wrap our arms around this community that needs more.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, you have like to add your thoughts?
No, and I'm new to the grief community, but there's a few things that have struck me. Number one, I think that this is an opportunity for us to bring support, not just to COVID, and COVID grief is really no different than grief. I mean, the loss of a parent is a traumatic event. Maria and I were speaking earlier today. There is so much stigma with COVID. I think there's stigma with other forms of parental death as well, but that there are resources available. And I think that would be my message, that whether they need to contact their school or their community leader, there are resources available to help these children. Mentoring is another, it's so integral to some children's grief path. And I would just argue the more we can bring, especially right now, this community together and leverage each other and the resources that we have. I've been so impressed with the quality of the resources and the availability of the resources, that children should not feel alone and they should not feel any type of stigma. And it's kind of the adult's responsibility to help them feel that way and to get to the resources needed.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, Catherine, in terms of the stigma of, COVID now, we're all talking about it. So there's a stigma, it's a little bit normalized, and building on your point that, what if your parent died by suicide, or your sibling, or a drug overdose, right? And being sensitive to that and trying to destigmatize that, that's very important to point out that it is a difficult topic, and that must be addressed. And now I think we have, Maria, I'll just ask you any closing thoughts in terms of your funder perspective, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And Rebecca, if there's some questions that you can kind of read to help out there. Maria?
Yeah, I just want to add, to your question about, what do we need to do? And I think everyone here, all the panelists, all of our partners really mentioned one clear thing. It is about the conversation in multiple ways, right? So first, it's the conversation with your community. Is your community aware of what the issue is, what the prevalence is, and where the resources are? Second, are we comfortable as adults? Because, if we're serving youth, or if we're funding programs that serve youth, are we equipping the individuals that have that direct relationship with youth, with the language, and also with the resources that they know where to refer? Through our Grief Sensitive Schools initiative, it's not about the educator being a grief counselor. It's about the educator knowing where to refer to, and also making it okay, having that safe space. So, grief is not an illness. It's actually, Catherine mentioned this, and I want to kind of emphasize this. Most children, most adults have a normal, adaptive grief response. If you miss someone, I lost my father when I was 23, and I remember my wedding day, happiest day, saddest day. And that is fine. That is absolutely fine. But we have to be comfortable with that. So the conversation that we need to have is not only it's self-care, it's training, but it's also making that space for that student, that child, to actually tell their own story. What is their story? So I think that's another component of this. And then Catherine mentioned this is, are there supports in legislation? Are there resources that are bigger? Because we know, unfortunately, BIPOC communities are at high levels experience this percentage-wise than their counterparts. So it's not necessarily just, the social emotional component resources, it's actually the financial resources. So that's where other funders can come in. If you focus on advocacy, if you focus on scholarship, if you focus on other issues that impact this group, you should be joining us. Again, as we're saying, through our Grief Sensitive Schools initiative, we're not asking educators to be grief counselors. We're asking them to have tools and information to support who they're serving. For funders, we're asking you to join us so you can actually increase the resources for these children, maybe not bereavement specific resources, but bereavement related and correlated resources. So that's my ask, and that's my call to action is let's elevate one, that this is an issue, because we do know that it is the #1 ACE. Children that lose a parent by death are at higher risk of academic risk, not performing as well, because they're not understood, they're not heard, they're not seen. So let's change that dialogue and change that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maria. And before I turn it over to Rebecca to close us out, I just want to thank all the panelists for their time, their efforts, and the work that they do. I'm sure that the rest of the folks on the call would agree with me that we definitely learned a lot about this issue, and it's something that we could all do something about. So it's not insurmountable, it's identifiable and actionable. So I leave you guys with that. Rebecca?
Thank you so much, Marlyn, Maria, Catherine, Sarah, and Laura. Tremendously helpful information. As you said, having that information is the most important place to start and being a partner in this awareness. We really appreciate you joining us today and everyone who's here on the call. Couple things just want to share at the end as we close out this conversation. So let me just throw up the slide there. So for folks on this call, we want to let you know that the Grant Makers for Education Conference in October will be in Austin, Texas in person. And actually, sorry, the slide should be updated. They have extended the deadline to April 1st to submit proposals. So all of the funders on this call who are submitting proposals know you have a few extra days to get your ideas out there. Also, a continuing thread on these calls that we've had over the last few months. We've talked about a lot of the workforce challenges. Want to let you know that the Power of Us workforce survey is now live. That is an attempt to capture data about all of the adults, volunteer and staff who work with young people to learn about who they are and what they need to stay in the field, so that you can get that survey at powerofussurvey.org. Please share that with all of your networks. We will be coming back together for a monthly call next month. We have shifted the date to April 29th rather than our usual third Friday because of holidays. So look out for that information and info on the topic for April 29th. And then just a quick message to the funders and EdFunders members on the call. We'll have a funder meetup on April 5th, where we'll really dive into some reflections on last month and this month's call topics and what we as funders can do to support young people experiencing loss. And as usual, the recordings from this call will be up on the EdFunders website in about a week. But want to thank you all for being here and have a wonderful Friday. Thank you again to our speakers.